Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Infirmary. And as you can see, we are on the road this week. And while we're on the road, we are going to be talking about brick runs. And what's a brick run? Well, if you're in the sport, you probably already know, but a brick run is when you run after cycling. And so anytime you do a triathlon or a duathlon, you're going to have to do a brick run or a run off the bike or a transition run. They go by a bunch of different names. Nobody's really sure why they're called bricks. Some people say it's because of the BR, bike run, and then there's an icky sensation in your legs when you are running off the bike. The other possibility is that your legs just feel like bricks. And that is what we are going to talk about today. How we can move from our legs feeling so terrible running off of the bike and dealing with that discomfort and actually going to be running more effectively and faster off of your bike ride. Okay, so first of all, the stakes, the differences between a well-trained and a poorly trained transition can be as much as 10%. So that might not seem like a lot at first, but if we're talking about a 140 half marathon versus 10% slower than that, that's going to be like a 150. That is a huge difference in your performance. That's going to completely take you to a different realm of result if you are 10 minutes slower than you actually had to be. And this effect compounds as the race gets longer because it's percentage based. So if you can be a little bit better at this, you are going to see, especially your longer races, improve and improve and improve. And one thing that we really see when we're looking at brick runs is that elites only lose about 1.5% of their performance from fresh when they're running off the bike, whereas less experienced athletes can lose up to 12%. So elites out there, we're going to talk about the reason why that might be so small, but you really want to narrow that gap. And there are going to be implications for you as an amateur that are based off of those elite training volumes and the time in the sport. Stuff that we can emulate in our own training, even if we are not elites and professionals. You might have gone to a transition clinic or attended one or seen one advertised in your area, and they are great. But they almost always focus on practicing being quicker in transition, so like little tricks to get your shoes on faster or rubber banding your shoes to your pedals and learning how to jump on the bike and slip your feet into them quicker. That's really great. You should definitely still go to those clinics. You should practice that stuff, but it's incomplete. Today, we're going to get under the hood of the physiological implications of riding and then running, and then talk about how you can adjust your training and your race day execution to help you run better off the bike. And we are going to be working with 4 different studies today. We're going to be working from the original study, Millet and Vleck in 2000, physiological and biomechanical adaptations to the cycle to run transition in Olympic triathlon. That was from the British Journal of Sports Medicine. Bonacci in 2011, neuromuscular control and running economy is preserved in elite international triathletes after cycling, sports biomechanics. Walsh 2019, the rise of elite short course triathlon re-emphasizes the necessity to transition efficiently from cycling to running. That just appeared in the journal Sports, which I love. I love that there's just an academic journal out there just called Sports. And then finally, Zwetsloot et al. Prolonged cycling lowers subsequent running mechanical efficiency in collegiate triathletes. BMC Sports Science, Medicine, and Rehabilitation from 2022. Okay, part 1. Before we actually get to the run, we are going to talk a little bit about what the bike actually does to you before the run. The bike doesn't just tire you out, it systematically changes the conditions under which you'll have to run. And there's 3 big areas that we're going to talk about that the bike changes before running. The first is your nervous system. The second has to do with fueling, and the third has to do with breathing. And stick with me on some of this. It's going to get a little bit physiological, but I think it's important. So, cycling is essentially a bunch of concentric contractions. Okay, wow, we're already in exercise physiology land. So, what's a concentric contraction? That's where the muscle shortens as it contracts. If you think about a biceps curl, this is probably the easiest illustration of this. So that as you're lifting the weight, think about what happens to that biceps muscle as you curl that weight. You can think about it, oh, that's right. The biceps goes from sort of a longer shape into a kind of shorter shape as I curl it up. And then running is eccentric. So the muscle lengthens while it contracts. And this particular one, think about lowering the weight of a bicep curl. And you can also start to see, eccentric might be a little bit more intense than concentric, because if you think about it, you've got that muscle contracted, so you've already got it flexed, and then you're going to lengthen it and stretch it out. This is the reason why when you do something like a deadlift, that you're really sore the next day, because you are taking a contracted muscle and then pulling on both ends of it. And that's when you get the micro traumas when you do a deadlift that eventually makes you stronger, but it also makes you really sore. Unsurprisingly, your body does not love to go from one particular type of contraction straight to the other type. Going from concentric to eccentric without any kind of preparation, it's kind of like taking a manual transmission car and shifting it, like without putting in the clutch, just kind of jamming that gearbox and that shift lever around until you get it into place. It's not good for the car. It's not really good for your legs. On top of that, there's a cadence mismatch a lot of the time. So cycling cadence, we're taught that you can really kind of do your own choice, your self-selected cadence, and that's true. Running cadence is a little bit tighter. We really know that ideal running cadence is between 88 and 92 RPM. And when I say an RPM, that's both feet, so right foot and then left foot. If we're talking about strides per minute, this number is going to be a lot closer to 170 to 180, because then we're counting each foot. So the closer that those cadences are as we approach T2, the better you're going to run off the bike. So say you are somebody who rides at around 80 RPM on the bike, but you know that you're going to be trying to run at maybe 86 to 88 RPM when you get off the bike. So you don't have to change your cadence for the entire bike leg, but as you get closer to your transition, you might want to think about that, because the bigger the gap between bike cadence and run cadence, the more difficult it is for your nervous system to make that adjustment and to send the correct signals to let you run effectively. The third part of the nervous system is proprioception. So proprioception is just your body's sense of itself in space. Like, where is my right hand right now? Where is my left toe? And it's something that you can train. And if you have better proprioception, you're just going to move better and your nervous system is going to be a little bit smoother. You can train proprioception through practice. So, setting up a transition zone and running through it a bunch of times. But you can also just improve your general proprioception through like any kind of skill-based sport or activity. Juggling's great. Ball sports are great. Anything that is going to put a real demand on your not just hand-eye coordination, but your foot-eye coordination, your leg-brain coordination, all of that stuff is going to improve your proprioception. Okay, problem number 2 is the fueling problem. And you're going to hear some things here where you're like, wait, does that really quite make sense? I promise, kind of stick with me and we'll get to something that really does make sense. So as you ride your bike and as you exercise in any way, you're burning through glycogen. And glycogen is just the carbohydrate form that is stored in our muscles. After we eat carbohydrates, it gets transformed into glycogen, gets stored in our muscles. Then we can use that to change it into glucose. Then we can use glucose to make adenosine triphosphate, blah, blah, blah. If you are burning through too much glycogen on the bike, and that means that you're probably not refueling effectively, your body is slowly going to shift towards fat oxidation. We always want to be using fat as a fuel, and you probably will be alongside the bike, but you can't run your system on fat alone. There's sort of a speed limit for it. And if you burn through all of your glycogen, then you're going to be basically bonking as you get off of the bike, and you're going to be trying to power your run with simply fat oxidation. Since running is pretty high intensity, you're going to be imposing a real speed limit on yourself if you don't fuel effectively during the ride. So having a good transition actually means like you really, really need to pay attention to all that fueling stuff. Another thing is dehydration, and that compounds how you're going to feel getting off the bike, because if you get dehydrated, there's actually less fluid in your system. There's going to be less blood that your body can basically pump around. And then what happens there, your heart rate has to compensate. So heart rate goes up. And what you can guess here, okay, if heart rate's going up, that means that your body is working harder to achieve the same end goal. And if you do that and you get off the bike, you're not going to be adequately prepared to run effectively. So really making sure that fuel through eating and drinking on the bike is going to really make your transitions better. But the big idea here that is lurking behind this fuel idea is that cycling can impair your economy on the run. If you've listened to us before, you know that economy is basically energy use. How much speed can we get out of a particular unit of energy? And if you don't fuel effectively, then your running economy is going to suffer. We're trying to stay as close to that 1.5 performance drop as possible that the elites display, rather than the 12% performance drop that we can see in some other athletes that are not as well trained. And then finally, there's a breathing problem. So if you are breathing too hard, if you're working too hard, you're going to actually fatigue your diaphragm and your intercostal muscles, which are the tiny little muscles that sit in between your ribs. And those are going to be even more fatigued if your pacing was poor or you didn't train effectively for how hard you're riding. So when you get off the bike then and you demand more from your diaphragm, from your intercostal muscles, then breathing feels harder than the pace should justify. And this peaks within the first 7 minutes of the run, which is exactly the period that we're trying to improve. So again, we can shorten that time frame, or we can eliminate it entirely with proper training and better pacing. And you're going to start hearing a lot of this, that actually, if we want to transition effectively, pacing is hugely important. Okay, next up, we're going to talk about just the difference between a transition run or a run off the bike or a brick and a fresh run. And the fact is that the difference between the two is really measurable, and the size of that gap tells you quite a bit about where that athlete is in their particular development. So, as we talked about before, elite triathletes are roughly only 1 to 2% less efficient running after cycling than running fresh. Amateurs, on the other side, show a lot closer to a 10 to 12% drop. And in one of the studies that looked at juniors versus elites, saw that junior national squad athletes land somewhere in between, suggests that this adaptation develops over time with repeated practice. I hate to tell you, but juniors probably train quite a bit more than you do. And there's no shame in getting beaten by a junior, because very often junior athletes are on their way to becoming elite athletes. So if you train more, and this is definitely in keeping with what we just know about training in general, is that if you do more training, in general, everything is going to improve. So if you can spend more time building your aerobic conditioning, running off the bike, running effectively, making your training look like the kind of transition that you're going to experience in the race, you are probably going to improve in your transitions. But just like anything, there's really very little in terms of a magic bullet. The reason that elites are better running off the bike is because they train a lot. It's the reason that they're elites. But you can really see when an athlete isn't running well off the bike pretty much because of some biomechanics. And the most visible sign is a forward trunk lean. So the athlete comes off the bike, and you will definitely see this in Ironman. If you see the kind of Ironman hunchback where an athlete is hinged from the hips, but they are not hinged from the ankles. They're not, their whole body isn't like nicely leaning forward in a straight line. And the reason why that's a problem is because that inhibits hip extension. So what's hip extension? That's about getting your foot as far back behind you as possible. If you think about what a really good elite runner looks like, their torso is vertical or slightly tipped forward, and their leg is way back behind them. So they've got really good hip extension, and they're able to do that without hinging forward. When you hinge forward from the hips, that inhibits hip extension and it shortens up your stride. And I'm sure if you have done an Ironman or 70.3 and maybe you hadn't been totally prepared for it, that one of the things that happens to you is your stride shortens up a lot. Another thing that happens is, and this was discovered by that Zwetsloot study in 2022, is that for whatever reason, when you are running in an ineffective and an inefficient way, you actually start using your anaerobic reserves at race pace, even when you probably should be using your aerobic system. And it's in the first 500 to 1,000 meters that's the highest risk window. So once again, that first kilometer off of the bike is really, really crucial. So we see that 70% of national level athletes run 10% slower than their average 10K pace in that first kilometer. Now, there's a bunch of reasons that they might have done that. They might have been for pacing. They might have been energy management. But we also know that that first kilometer is really crucial if you are trying to be competitive. And so this might be one of the reasons that's going on here, is that if you don't practice your transitions effectively and you don't work on strength and core work and posture and all the stuff that's just going to make you a much better athlete, definitely work on core strength, definitely work on trunk strength, then you're going to use your anaerobic system a little bit more, is what this study found. And of course, using your anaerobic system burns through a ton of glycogen. It's really inefficient, but it does get you where you need to be. But we already saw earlier that one of the things that inhibits good transitions is glycogen depletion. And so we really, really want to make sure that you have all of your strength training done and you've got great posture and great core strength, so that when you do come off of the bike, that you aren't displaying that forward trunk lean that we see from, Ironman athletes late in the race. And then here's this last little clue in this second section here is about variable versus steady state cycling. And this is one of the problems with a few of the studies that we looked at in this particular, that looked at transitions, is that 2 out of the studies use steady state cycling in the lab before the run. So fixed wattage, consistent cadence, and that is not at all what draft legal triathlon looks like. And a lot of the information here that we're talking about today comes from draft legal racing information. Most of you aren't draft legal athletes, but there's something really important that we can learn here. So if you're in a draft legal race, you're going to be surging to bridge gaps. You're going to be accelerating out of corners. You've got to respond to attacks, things like that. You've got to, if you didn't swim well, you've got to bridge up to the main group. So it's a very stochastic or variable kind of cycling. You're on, you're off, you're on, you're off. And this creates a different and much worse metabolic state than steady state cycling. Again, you're going to be going back and forth between aerobic and anaerobic. You're going to be churning through a lot of glycogen. And we already know that churning through glycogen is going to make your transitions a lot worse. So if you are a draft legal athlete, then you absolutely have to do your brick training with variability. So that kind of surges and slows and that kind of thing. But for the rest of us, which is like 90% of us, those of us that are doing non-draft racing, there's a real strong clue here that in order to run well off the bike, we want to make our riding as steady state, smooth, and consistent as possible. If you go out there and you ride your non-draft triathlon like it's a draft legal race, you're getting out of the saddle, you're attacking hills, you're trying to close gaps, you're passing people, you're going to have the same problems that draft legal athletes have if they haven't trained for their transitions. And so this is another really important message and lesson that, especially if you're doing non-draft racing, you need to make your cycling as smooth as possible. So how do you do that? Well, first of all, try not to get out of your saddle as much as you can. Sometimes you need to just to kind of break it up. Sometimes it can be very boring and not feel very good if you're just consistently locked into your aero bars and sitting on your saddle for 4, 5, 6 hours. That's not really super comfortable. So every now and then, totally fine to jump up out of the saddle. But if you're constantly out of the saddle, if you are riding hard up hills and then coasting the downhills, you're going to end up with a very high variability index. We're not really going to talk about variability index here, but basically it measures how smooth an athlete pedals. In order to smooth things out as much as you can, you're going to want to back off on the hills and shift to an easy gear, stay seated and just spin up the hills. And then you're going to want to get back on the power and pedal as much as you can as you're going downhill from that climb. If you're on flats, you have no excuse to not do this correctly. Consistent cadence, ideally between 80 to 90 RPM at a wattage that you absolutely know that you can hold for the duration of the event. So if you want to run effectively off the bike, one of the big culprits, if you don't, is a high variability during the cycling portion. And again, that means big surges, attacks, attacking climbs, things like that. We want to make it as smooth as possible. Imagine like a narrow band of power, and you want to stay within that narrow band of power as much as possible over the course of the ride. Okay, finally, what do we actually do about it? You don't need endless bricks, and you certainly don't need really long bricks. And what you really do need to be thinking about are the 2 kilometers on either side of T2, not just the transition zone. Yes, of course, again, practice your transitions, but if you really want to have the best transitions possible, you also got to focus on the last kilometer of the bike, first kilometer of the run. So as you come to that final kilometer on the bike, bring your intensity down, but bring your cadence as close to your run cadence as you can. So if you are below 80 RPM on the bike, try to bring it up into the 80s because you're probably going to be running somewhere in the 80s. Make sure you get your last fueling in because you're riding a little easier. It's totally easy to get a gel in now, get some fluid, that sort of thing. Inside T2, simple and repeatable. Helmet off, running shoes on, grab your run gear, grab your hat, go. That number belt goes on as you leave transition. There's no need to stand there and put your number belt on while you're hanging out by your bike. And remember, you're only going to really feel the discomfort in the first kilometer of the run. So run easy, but really try to focus on being fluid. Really, really try to not hinge at the hips. Think about leaning forward from the ankles. And if you know in advance what's going to feel bad, so heavy legs, harder breathing, difficult to find a rhythm. So when those things happen, that's confirmation that your race is going to plan, not evidence that you are falling apart. So just be prepared for things to kind of suck for a few minutes. Okay, second, just please stop doing long brick runs. They don't improve your transition. They replace quality training time with a tired, biomechanically efficient run. So remember, if you haven't done your core and your trunk work, you probably are going to hinge from the hips getting off the bike. And then if you go and run for an hour in that compromised position, you're essentially retraining bad habits when that is not good. That's going to make you a worse athlete at transition. So instead, what I would really suggest is get 3 or 4 cracks at a transition in a single session. So warm up, and then we're going to do 4 times through 15 to 20 minutes of riding on the bike and spend the last 5 minutes at race pace. And remember, race pace includes a kilometer where you back things off and you bring your cadence up to that 80 to 90 range, and then followed by a 1K run. So maybe do like a 500 meter out, 500 meter back. Only focus on rhythm in the first 500 meters and then build up to race pace in the second 500 meters. Get recovered, get a sip, things like that, back on the bike, and just go back and forth, do that 3 or 4 times. That's going to really train that specific adaptation that you need in order to get better at transitions. And then finally, Have a plan for getting punched in the face. We all know Mike Tyson's immortal observation that everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face. Well, in triathlon, everyone has a plan until they step off the bike. So, the mental component of a good transition is preparing for what's going to feel bad. So, when it arrives, you recognize it as normal and not catastrophic. So, if you know the first kilometer is going to feel like, and you have a deliberate plan for posture, pace, and breathing, you're going to stay in control instead of reacting. And that's a really good reason to do that workout that I just said above. If you continue to do that, you're going to get better and better and better at these transitions. And pretty soon it's just going to be a no brainer. So, here at the end, triathlon is not swimming, cycling, and running stitched together. It is a single sport. And the athletes who race it best, they treat it that way. They know that if you waste energy in the swim or you aren't swimming to your potential, that's going to cost you on the bike because you're going to have to bridge up to the group that you want to be in. Or if you swam slower than you were kind of hoping to, you're going to have to put in some more energy on the bike to get back to where you want. And that is going to come back to haunt you later. And then a poorly ridden bike costs you on the run. We really want to stay away from that high variability that we see in draft legal racing. If you're a draft legal triathlete, you really need to include that variable cycling in your training when you're practicing transitions. So the transition is just one more place to save energy or throw it away. So make sure that you're training the links between the disciplines, and swim to bike is another one that you'd really probably want to practice a little bit more. It doesn't get as much attention because probably the bike to run transition is going to affect your final position quite a bit more than your swim to bike. But swimming to cycling is also really dislocating. You go from horizontal to predominantly vertical, even though on a TT bike, your torso is somewhat horizontal. You should practice that one too, because just like bike to run, swim to bike is going to affect how much energy that you use over the course of the race. And if you've listened to me for a long time, you know triathlon is an energy cascade. We want to surrender as little energy as we can from the swim to the bike and then the bike to the run. Today, we talked a ton about saving that energy on the bike so that we can run effectively, and then doing the transition and the first kilometer of the run in an effective way so that you can actually run to your potential. I hope this was helpful. There's going to be links to all three of the articles in the show notes below. And yeah, please let me know if there's anything that you want to hear coming up, and get in contact with us. Let me know if you hated this episode. Let me know if you loved this episode. Always happy to talk about that. But in any case, thanks for visiting the infirmary, and I hope you're feeling better.